I wanted to give you guys a good update because there's been a lot of bad news when we're hearing about the shell shortage in Ukraine, or how the Ukraine immigration deal got sunk by Trump because Trump wanted to choose his campaign over country. But we do have some good news when it comes to security assistance to Ukraine. In Europe, there has been a fight going on for months over billions of dollars in economic assistance to Ukraine. The core of the fight has been Viktor Orban holding the $50 billion, which is supposed to be given to Ukraine over a 4-year period. So it isn't like $50 billion in 1 year, it's $50 billion over a multiple year period. He's holding it because, well, to be frank, he's engaging in hostage tactics. He has aid that is supposed to be going to Hungary that's being held up. And the reason it's being held up is because Hungary violated EU laws and regulations. And if you violate EU laws and regulations, one of the penalties that might come to you is that you're not going to get EU aid. And when I say EU aid, what I mean is these are other countries that have paid into the EU whose money is going to be given to Hungary. So this isn't a case of like, oh, like Hungary like put all this money into a fund and it was frozen. This is money coming from Germany, France, and other countries to finance Hungary if they abide by the rules and regulations. Now, some of that has already been let go by EU courts. I think $10 billion of it has already been let go to be sent to Hungary. The courts say it's because that they have done some reform when it comes to the judicial system. Some MPs, European MPs, are skeptical about that, saying, was this actually let go to see if they could get some movement to allow Ukraine to start the EU accession process? But all that's speculation, and I don't want to engage in the speculation. But Viktor Orban has been wanting more EU financial assistance. Viktor Orban has also aligned himself somewhat ideologically and politically with Vladimir Putin, still highly reliant on Russian energy exports. And so he has made himself a sticking point when it comes to Ukraine's strategy to fight off the Russians, constantly talking about how they can't take back all their land. And not only can they not take back all their land, but that it'd be better for them to make a deal, and that all these sanctions on the Russians are not really working. And he wants to go back to business as it was before, but the rest of Europe isn't buying it. And so after a bunch of legislators got together and said, this is too much, we're thinking about triggering Article 7, and Article 7 would take away Hungary's voting rights because it violated EU laws and regulations. Once they started to reach this precipice, because negotiations were getting more and more heated, Orban was getting less and less tolerated, it seems that Orban is going to relent. That the pressure upon Orban from Article 7 and from other legislators, and maybe the 10 billion that was released in that court case, has pushed him to almost certainly at this point approve the aid on February 1st. February 1st is when the EU officials are all going to come together and meet up, and they're going to discuss a bunch of issues, including the $50 billion. That's the day we're going to have a resolution to this. So we have gotten a bunch of positive signals. The first positive signal we got was from the Finnish foreign ministry, which said that they were certain that Viktor Orban was going to approve a deal. Then after that, we got other stuff like the Prime Minister of Ukraine coming out saying all EU members appear to agree on approving a 4-year aid package. This is the 50 billion. But the thing that really made me say, oh, there isn't any turning around now, or, I mean, it could still, but I think the odds are heavily against it, is that Kiev is working on a trip for Viktor Orban to visit Ukraine. This is from the Deputy Prime Minister. There is no way that the Ukrainians would organize a trip for this pot-bellied tyrant if he did not approve the aid, or was not about to approve the aid. This man has not stepped on Ukrainian soil for 14 years. For 14 years, he has not entered Ukrainian territory. And so if he hasn't been there for 14 years, the only way the Ukrainians are going to budge on that is if they have good reason to believe that he's going to approve the 50 billion and that he's not blocking EU accession anytime in the near future. So I think this right here, for me, is like the final nail in the coffin for Orban's continued blocking of the 50 billion in economic assistance to Ukraine, which is desperately needed for them to keep the state afloat as they funnel 65% of the state budget into the war economy. My goodness. This is good though. I wonder though if this is going to be the end or this is going to be just the beginning. And what I mean by that is when Viktor Orban allowed Ukraine to go forward with EU accession talks, they didn't do it by voting in favor. They did it by walking out of the room, so they basically abstained from the vote. So they didn't have to vote against it. This was suggested by Olaf Scholz during the meeting. But there are still a bunch of other points, as the EU has just started to go through Ukrainian laws to make sure that they're in line with EU regulations and make sure there isn't any conflicting areas, and if there are, to help flatten that out with Ukraine. There's going to be multiple stages along the way. I think there's like 20 points or maybe more where Viktor Orban could stand up again and try to halt the process. And if he does do that, then he could then ask for example, more economic assistance to Ukraine from the to Hungary from the EU. Oh, maybe if you let up more of my aid, then I'll allow this next stage to go on. This is why I'm against the deal being done for the 4 years of aid to Ukraine being, okay, every year we have to reapprove it. If every year we have to reapprove it, all that's going to do is create a hostage crisis every year, when the original intent of the legislation of the aid from Ukraine was not, oh, we're just getting aid, which is just the money, it's just the funds, which of course that's the main purpose, but it was also to send a signal that the EU is with Ukraine. The EU is with Ukraine. They're going to stick with Ukraine. Ukraine's going to be a future EU state, and they're going to be supporting them way into the future. However long this war is, we're with them as long as it takes. And for whatever it takes. At least that's supposed to be the spiritual idea of it. That's supposed to be the message it sends. So if every year, the Russians could work with Orban to undermine it, or Orban could undermine it to try to advance his own interests, leverage it for his own gain, when there's an active war going on with people dying on the front line, and this is needed yesterday, not tomorrow. Yeah, no, I don't think that would be smart to allow that crisis to kind of happen, to allow Orban to have another point where he could leverage to delay aid to Ukrainians to help himself and try to subvert the rules process in the EU. And plus, he already has that opportunity when it comes to EU accession. So giving him more opportunities to do it is just asking for a problem. Either way, though, despite the possible future hurdles that EU accession might bring, and if EU diplomats or EU officials agree to make this, aid that you approve every year, which I really hope they don't. I know some articles talked about they were at the very least considering it. I know that many were against it for many of the same reasons I was. Point is, though, the 50 billion is probably going to get through in the next 5 to 6 days. And that's good. But that also means that we need to turn our attention not only to the Italians or the French or the Spanish, who probably should be giving more bilateral aid to the Ukrainians, or to the South Koreans and the Japanese, who are going to need to rely on to get more M7777 artillery shells to the Ukrainians. But now we need to turn inward and look at the fact that the Republicans just sunk a Ukraine immigration deal after Mike Johnson said at the start that he didn't want to lump things that were unrelated together, but then we caved and said, fine, we'll do it anyway. Then after months of negotiation, it was sunk because Trump didn't like it, because if we were to do anything about immigration, it could hurt Trump's campaign chances. So now we need to turn our attention inward, because the military assistance we can provide is on a different scale than any single nation state in Europe can, or even collectively, as their industry is just not caught up enough. And our industry is not caught up enough to compete with the Russian artillery production and supporting the Ukrainian war effort right now. But we are certainly one of the most powerful Ukrainian backers, and having that blocked off as we're trying to expand production is not helping. And this is the problem too. When we eventually approve aid, probably sometime next month, right? When we eventually approve this aid, it's not going to be like, great, the aid just shows up. It's going to take a month or 2 or 3 for the aid to actually start getting there. For us to take the M777 howitzer shells, put them on the trucks, bring them to the ports, take them overseas, take them to the border, goes across the border, goes to storage facilities in Ukraine, then it's taken from the storage facilities to positions near forward operating positions, near the artillery positions, and then it's distributed and fired. It's going to take time. And so the longer we wait, it's not like, okay, we waited till February, they're going to get their shells in February. It's okay, we waited till February, now they're going to get their shells in April. if we're lucky. At the very least, though, when we do approve it, even though they're not going to immediately get the shells, the Ukrainians can at least start planning into the future because they'll have some idea of what they're actually getting from the West.